Today we want to welcome Dr. Tom Middlebrook. Dr. Middlebrook is a native of Nacogdoches, Texas. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in geology from Stephen F. Austin State University in 1974, a Master of Arts degree in psychology from SFA in 1977, and a Doctor of Medicine from Southwestern Medical School in 1983. Dr. Middlebrook currently runs a private practice of child and adolescent psychiatry in Nacogdoches. He is the co-founder of the East Texas Archaeological Society, the East Texas Archaeological Conference, and the East Texas Caddo Research Group. He has served as the past president for both the Dallas Archaeological Society and the Texas Archaeological Society. Dr. Middlebrook is the recipient of the 2015 Crabtree Award from the Society for American Archaeology and has served as an archaeological steward for the Texas Historical Commission for over 30 years. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Tom Middlebrook.
Thanks, Drew, very much. I'm excited to be here to share about something that's been near and dear to my life and a research group that I work with for the last decade. We're going to be talking about finding Tejas, the archaeology of the first location of Mission Concepcion, which of course is a very famous mission in San Antonio today, but this is its first location, and some associated sites with it that give context to it. This is my outline that I hope to follow through with. First, I want to talk about the significance of this discovery and what Mission Concepcion, Mission Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de la Hainai, what its importance is. This, of course, is the Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception to the Hainai Indians. I will give a historical background to put it into some context, and then talk at length about how we found this mission. Additionally, I will go through the archaeology of the 4 sites that make up the mission complex, and an associated site, the Mayhew site, which was a trading post for Saint Denis. So the significance of Mission Concepcion is really bears on great importance to the state of Texas. It is the earliest known European site in East Texas. There were a few earlier European sites in East Texas. For example, there were 2 missions around 1690, and there undoubtedly were some 1500s DeSoto sites in Northeast Texas, but none of those have been discovered. So this is the earliest European site yet discovered, as it is also the earliest Spanish mission in Spanish Texas. Spanish Texas is the southeastern half or 2/3 of the state of Texas, and the western part of the state, such as El Paso, where there were some even earlier missions, are really more associated with Santa Fe and not with the Provincia de Tejas. It was the first headquarters of the East Texas missions that were founded in 1716, and it was placed in the village of the Cadi, or the chief leader of the Hasinai Caddo. It was referred to by the Spanish as the capital of the Tejas. It's the only site known to be the residence of Angelina, the first important woman of Texas, and we'll talk about her. It also is the only site known to honor Maria de Agreda, the Lady in Blue. It's the original location of San Antonio's Mission Concepcion de Acuña, which is today an important part of the San Antonio National Park, which is a World Heritage Site. Additionally, it provides a new understanding that was provided by its discovery for the original location of El Camino Real de la Tejas. So the historical background must begin with the Hasinai Caddo. The Hasinai were a collection of Caddo communities in the Angelina Natchez River drainage, kind of seen here in the lower left-hand area, which was a group of 9 to 13 Caddo villages. The Hasinai were a moderately hierarchical community. We know that the Caddos broadly over the almost millennia that they were in East Texas had ceremonial centers, including mound centers. They were typically lived as sedentary farmers in extended communities composed of farmsteads and hamlets along creeks and rivers, and they would have a central location where their Kadi, their headman, would live, where their dance floor would be, and where important community ceremonies would take place. They were farmers. They grew corn, squash, and beans, and other cultigens. They also gathered nuts and berries. They were great hunters. They made powerful bows out of bodark wood. They locally killed deer. They also, we know, ate turtle and fish and other mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. They would go once a year off to the southern Great Plains on great bison hunts. And during those times, sometimes they would snag a bear or two. They were known for their trade in bear grease. They were great potters. In fact, they were no doubt the greatest ceramicists of ancient Texas. They were respected warriors. They were eloquent of speech, and they were known for their diplomacy. The painting at the right is that of their principal religious leader, the Grand Shanasi, in this wonderful painting by Rita Peale. Mr. Moon is sometimes he's referred to. In this particular picture, down in the very middle of these, you'll see a designation of the Hainai. This was one of the constituent tribes of the Hasinai Caddo, and they were the lead tribe, and we will talk about them at length. These actually are probably the 5 most well-known Hasinai communities. The Nabadachi, who lived along San Pedro Creek in far northwestern Houston County. Then across the Neches River, which is here, were the Nechi. Then the Hainai lived just to the east of the Angelina River, which is running here between Nacogdoches and Lufkin. They occupied much of western Nacogdoches County in the 16 and 1700s. The Nacogdoches were around today's Nacogdoches and lived up and down the Lanana Creek. The southern or lower Nasoni lived north into Russ County. So these were the principal groups, and these groups right here were along the El Camino Real de la Tejas when the Spanish first came in the early 1700s. So that's the way the world was until this man came along, La Salle, a Frenchman who is famous for being the first man to travel down the Mississippi River. And then in 1681, he reached the mouth of the Mississippi and claimed the drainage of the entire Mississippi drainage for the King of France. This had tremendous effects because it put a wedge in between Spain's claim of La Florida, and they had originally claimed all of the southern part of the United States and the Southwest for Spain, but the French intruded into this area, and their frontier was in the Caddo homeland, particularly in this area of the Hasinai Confederacy or band of tribes. Well, La Salle could not leave well enough alone. He went back to France after discovering the mouth of the Mississippi, went back up to Quebec and over to France, but he came back with 4 ships. One turned around in the Caribbean and went back. Another left and went back to France after they hit Matagorda Bay. They were trying to get to the mouth of the Mississippi, but missed by several hundred miles to the west and hit Texas instead. La Salle set up Fort St. Louis up on Garcetas Creek. So another ship went back, and his 2 remaining ships, including La Belle, sank eventually. His group of Frenchmen that came with him had a terrible time at Fort St. Louis. Many died due to snake bites and starvation, disease, and by negative interactions with the natives of that area. LaSalle himself was a larger-than-life figure with a robust personality. Perhaps today he might even be considered to have some sort of bipolar disorder. He certainly had a big problem with temper and anger. He went off to the west and then other places, venturing out from Fort St. Louis. And we know he went up to the Hasinai Caddo area in East Texas, which the French referred to as Les Sinis, which is the western part of the Hasinai Caddo territory. He interacted with them, went back to Fort St. Louis, and decided to try to go to the north and east to hit the Mississippi River, which he did. However, partway along, some of his companions, perhaps resentful of his behavioral style, assassinated him near Navasota. The remnants of the group went on back up through the Hasinai Caddo area and eventually made their way to the Mississippi and back to Europe. Henri Joutel, a priest that was with that group, wrote an important diary of his encounter in this time period. This is a famous painting by Catlin that now hangs at the National Gallery, showing LaSalle meeting the Hasinai group, probably the Navajo, over on San Pedro Creek. It's maybe reasonably accurate, except the hills in East Texas don't quite look like this today. Well, the Spaniards were extremely unhappy with the French coming into their area, and they sent out a dozen or so, more or less, expeditions from Mexico to try to find Fort St. Louis and to crush it. It took them a while to find it, and eventually when they did, there was not much left there, but they put a presidio right on top of it. But one of their ventures went into the Hasinai Kingdom of the Tejas in far eastern Texas and set up in 1690 a couple of missions. One was Mission San Francisco that was along San Pedro Creek. The other, with Mission Maria, was actually on the Natchez, which was very ill-fated. It flooded right away. But the Navajo Hasinai Caddo were not at all happy with the Spaniards, in part because they would engage in last rites of various Caddo people, and those people immediately died. They thought that there was some connection. Also, the Spanish soldiers molested, apparently, some of the women of the villages, and the Hasinai rose up and basically forced the Spaniards out in 1693 out of East Texas. One of the fathers that were in the group there in the San Pedro area was Father Hidalgo. He never lost his passion to convert and Christianize and minister to the Tejas Indians in the great kingdom of the Tejas. And he wrote the French, asking them to set up a common expedition into the Hasinai Caddo area for the purposes of trade and for Christianizing the Caddo. Governor Cadillac sent a young man who had been born in Quebec and had traveled to Louisiana and had been there for almost 20 years, and sent him, this is Saint Denis, up the Red River to Caddo country in 1713. So this is Louis Jussereau de Saint Denis, very important person, because he founded a post in Natchitoches in 1714, which is the oldest European settlement in the Louisiana Purchase, which is about a fourth of the continental United States. He was the first then to really trade actively with the Hasinai Caddo later that year, and then eventually made his way down to Presidio San Juan Bautista, the northerly fort of the Spanish, just south of the Rio Grande River in 1714. He was captured. They didn't know what he was doing. Why are you here? So after a while, they sent him to Mexico City, but he was a very influential person. He himself had a fairly magnificent personality. He charmed the folks. He ended up marrying the commandant's young relative in 1716, and he declared some loyalty to the Spanish. They let him go free. In fact, they named him the quartermaster and the guide of an expedition to East Texas, leading or serving in the road as El Conductor of this great Spanish expedition into East Texas to set up 4 missions in 1716. So this really is the story of the Hasinai and the Spanish in the early 18th century. Domingo Ramon, the son of Diego Ramon, the commandant's son, was sent on this expedition, and he took the president and fathers of the 2 Franciscan colleges. One in Querétaro was led by Father Espinosa. The other was the great Franciscan college in Zacatecas, led by Antonio Margil de Jesus. And they went to East Texas. Margil later in 1716 and then in 1717 established yet 2 more missions, one in today's San Augustine, Texas, Mission Dolores, and another over in Robeline, Louisiana, Mission San Miguel. But it was a hard time for the first couple of years. There was a drought, there was starvation, crops didn't come in. So in 1718, Governor Alarcon, the governor of the Provincia de Coahuila and Tejas, came and resupplied the 6 missions in the eastern province. He also renamed the area around Mission Concepcion and called it Pueblo Concepcion de Agreda. The very next year, the French, in a small band of French soldiers, very small band, under Lieutenant Blondel, went over and raided San Miguel, and there was the famous Chicken War, which a little bit humorously, because the only real victims were some frustrated chickens who flapped around and irritated the horses. Some of them were taken hostage and perhaps killed, but none of the Spanish were killed. They all fled back one to another of the Spanish missions and eventually back to Bejar or San Antonio, and they abandoned East Texas for a couple of years until the next governor, the Marquis de Aguayo, came back with a massive army of 500 Spanish troops and a bunch of other citizens and thousands of livestock, of horses, pigs, and cows, and reestablished the 6 missions and the 2 presidios on the eastern frontier. In 1730, the 3 western missions, which include Mission Concepcion, along with San Francisco and San Jose, the ones that were under the Querétaro College, and the Presidio Dolores, were all closed and moved back to Central Texas, briefly in the in the Austin, Texas area, and then in 1731, famously in San Antonio. So where were these 4 missions? Well, here they are. There was one, these 4 missions with San Francisco over on the Natchez with the Natchez Indians. Then there was the topic of our talk today, Concepcion, and Mission Guadalupe in Nacogdoches. To the north, there was the Mission San Jose to the Nasoni Indians. These were the 4 primary original missions in 1716, but Mission Concepcion represented the headquarters of those first 4 missions. There was a couple of other important sites. One was the Presidio, about a league away, we think, to the north, and a couple of leagues away, Saint Denis apparently had a trading post. These, I'll go back, these are the locations of Mission Maria that was very briefly on the Neches River in 1690, and San Francisco that was a 3-year-long mission over on San Pedro Creek. So this is just to illustrate the fact that in 1731, Concepcion moved to San Antonio. Today is Mission Concepcion de Acuña. Then San Jose became San Juan Capistrano, and Mission San Francisco became Espada, and they're famous today in San Antonio. So this is it. This is where the original Mission Concepcion was, on this landform east of the Angelina River. Later it was called Pueblo Concepcion de Agreda. Right now in this picture, it looks like a beautiful park. This is not the way we found it at all. And we spent months clearing it out of brush and small trees so that we could do an archaeological work. I want to talk a little bit about our discovery. And it was really inspired by this gentleman, Dr. Jim Corbin, who, beginning well back in the 1970s, had talked to me about going to find Mission Concepcion. I frankly wasn't much interested at the time. However, later on, I became very interested. And then after his very untimely death in 2004, in March of 2005, I made a dedicated effort to find Mission Concepcion. And to do so, I put together a very large team of folks. This is some of the key players, but there were many, many others that were involved. The first person I'll highlight here is Dr. Morris Jackson, MD, PhD. He's a retired radiologist in Nacogdoches, but he's also an archaeological steward. And then this is Dr. George Avery, a historic archaeologist who's been our mentor and guide through all of this research. These are some other folks down here, part of the stewardship action team that went to the field on many weekends. This is Mark Walters, a steward who was invaluable to our research, and professional archaeologist Bo Nelson, who was key to our work. And then finally, Jeff Williams, who's probably the leading expert on the routes of El Camino Real de la Tejas in East Texas. So where do you find Mission Concepcion? Based on the historical records, the diaries, and a possession document that we found that Domingo Ramon gave to the priest, we had 5 clues. And this is all we had. We knew that it was a half a league east of the Angelina River. That's big territory. That it was on some sort of north-south aligned mesa east of the Caddo village. It was near 2 bubbling or flowing springs at the margin of the mesa. The springs were not large enough. They were small, not big enough to supply the needs of the village, but one of them flowed down into a little marshy area. That's all we had. And we had this big territory to look at. The University of Texas, Herbert Bolton, back in a century ago and before, really, in the early 1900s, proposed that it was just east of Linwood Crossing on the upper road of the El Camino Real de la Tejas. In the 1930s, this man, Robert Bruce Blake, very famous for a collection of Spanish documents he put together, the Blake Collection. He was a county clerk, and he proposed that it was down here, just east of the Goodman Bridge. And in fact, he placed the 1936 marker there. Jim Corbin found a map of Juan Pedro Walker from the early 1800s in Yale University, and it showed the outline of the road going along here and crossing about here. So he felt for sure the mission was off in this area. For the first 3 years of a 5-year search for the mission, we looked in this area. In fact, I looked personally over almost every square inch of any and nothing of the Spanish colonial material. Then we turned to the north. Finally, we found it midway between the northern and southern end. In May of 2010, when Bo Nelson, Mark Walters, and Chet Walker were with me one day, we were walking over an area, and Bo and Mark reached down and picked up some Caddo pottery and a small mission point. And 5 days later, Morris Jackson and I went back with metal detectors. We found this pintle, which is a part of a hinge, a forged nail, an early iron forged nail, part of a rowel of a spur, another forged nail, a musket ball, and some Caddo pottery. At that point, we determined to take a very careful look at this area. So when we marked out the area, it seemed to fit all the historical markers. This is just a schematic. Truthfully, there were hundreds of places between the northern and southern end of our search area that could have fit this. And again, we went to places that fit everything. But when we finally found the artifacts that would prove it, it was about a half a league from the Angelina River. It was on this rise that kind of went north and south, not very long rise. It was near a Caddo village. And then when there were some little springs coming down into a little marshy area, it fit all of the geographic clues that we had. I must say there were a number of other things that fit the clues as well. When we finally found it, there were actually 4 archaeological sites. The key one, which we referred to as the falls site, because there was just to its southeast a waterfalls along a little spring-fed creek, one that the Spanish never talked about, interestingly. It's referred to as 41 NA 133. Just for you that are not familiar with this is how we number archaeological sites. 41 stands for Texas, NA is Nacogdoches County, and it was the 344th archaeological site to be recorded. There were 2 other sites to the north, 334, which was what we refer to as a mission-related site, because there were some Spanish material there. But there were other things there as well, which we'll find out. And then just to its south is 346, which is another Spanish and especially Native American site. Off in the field to the west, off of this landform, is a site where Caddo Indian materials are found, which we refer to as the village of the Hainai or Hainai Hayfield. 345. Before we did much excavation, we did magnetometer, a remote sensing technique on all 4 of these sites. We did some other kinds of remote sensing as well, but predominantly magnetometer. Chet Walker, who received his PhD from the University of Texas, helped us. And as you can see, these magnetometer images. Truthfully, the southern 2 told us more about the geology of the sites and not much about the archaeology. But the northern 2, as you will see, the magnetometer helped us considerably. And over the years, in addition to our kind of core group of researchers that have gone out on many weekends and holidays to do research, we've pulled together various avocational and public groups such as the East Texas Archaeological Society, the Boy Scouts of America, a group called the House of Marhil that studied the life of the Spanish priest Antonio de Jesus Marhil. And then stewards of the Texas Archaeological Stewardship Network have come out on numerous occasions and have been helpful to us in our research. So what did we find? Let's go through each of these 4 sites within this complex. The first is the fall site, NA 344. This is where the mission proper was. Dr. Jackson in this photo on the right is standing about in the middle of where the mission church, we believe, stood at one time. Here's a magnetometer survey over here. Frankly, it doesn't tell us much. There was a historic livestock pen up here. There's some roads going through here. Not much of this corresponds to the mission archaeology. I show this because I wanted to make a point of our topographic map, which shows that the mission area is actually on a slope. To make a broader point, that in most of the Spanish colonial, early 18th century Spanish colonial sites in the eastern Provincia de Tejas, most of them are on a slope of some kind. So this is at the tip end of this mesa. This is a little marsh and a spring that went up to the mission area, most of which was contained within a 60 by 60 meter unit. This is the magnetometer of that. And there was a 40 by 40 down below it. Well, what about the archaeology itself? Well, excavation was not very profitable because this site was extremely shallow. It was deflated. All the sandy soils that may have one time been there were gone. Indeed, at 5 centimeters, just 2.5 inches or 2 inches below the surface, you hit brick hard, sterile clay. And the few artifacts that were found were all in the top 5, and in some cases, 10 centimeters. So not long after our initial excavations, we abandoned traditional excavation and decided with a considerable amount of professional input to do a systematic metal detecting survey. And every single artifact that we found, and over 550 metal objects were then plotted to the very centimeter of their location. The greatest majority of the metal objects that we found were architectural elements, nails in particular. 2/3 of all the metal was nails. You can see several of the nails here, and this is the pintle part of a hinge. Most of them were clustered in the middle of our site, and we believe this is where the church stood, kind of the crest of this little hill. Over to the northwest was a residential area where we believe the house of the Padres was. And off to the southeast, there was probably some other structures, very few other artifacts down here, by the way. Perhaps these were storage or stable areas. Some evidence from kind of inside the church area, for example, or some metal artifacts here that appear to be a part of a locking system in a chest. And we see several of these evidence that would relate to a chest. We're not for sure, but we believe that it's possible that this chest may have contained vestments of the Padres in the church itself, or other important articles that would have been needed for communion by the priest. We did a limited amount of mechanical scraping, hoping to find evidence of post holes where structures may have found, and that did not turn out so well. The soil is very shallow, and we were unable to identify post holes, but our research is not complete yet. We have some other ideas about this. But up in the northwest area, we did find, in the area where we believe the Spanish Padres lived, we found some evidence of residential life. The only glass was found in this area, part of Spanish 18th century wine bottles. We found a leg of a metate or a molcajete that was made of Mexican volcanic rock that would have been brought into the area from Mexico. And a number of blue beads were found in this area, perhaps again suggesting the possibility of a residential area. Remember the color blue, that will come back. The most common artifacts of all at Mission Concepcion were Native American Caddo or Hainai ceramics. In fact, there were 1,300 and more Caddo ceramics found so far with a limited amount of excavation at this site. Most of which, in fact, 63 or 4% of them were brushed as the main decoration, which is typical for these Hasinai Caddo ceramics in the Angelina Natchez Basin. These are some of the other decorated vessels that include Patten Engrave, King Engrave, Lindsay Groove, Spradley Brush and Size, and what we've named Mayhew Rectilinear. These are common to this. Archaeologically, we refer to as Allen phase ceramics in the Angelina Natchez area. There were gun parts. In fact, in total, I think there were about 35 gun parts found, both of cupreous or brass material and iron material. These were of flintlock guns. Most all, what we believe, were French Type C trade guns. In fact, down here at the bottom right, you'll find a trigger guard with this specific design, which metal expert Jay Blaine has termed the Chevrolet design. And he has reported that he has never seen this particular design in this form after 1730. So it clearly fits this Type C French trade gun. And we believe the French were trading with the Spanish and trading with the Native Americans. And the Native Americans may have been trading back with the Spanish for these guns. This is also a Type C trade gun. This is one of the 2 items out of the 35 that we're convinced actually represent a Spanish gun. Truthfully, the Padres were far away from the closest Spanish outpost for things that they could get. This is some Spanish horse gear, part of a bridle, some of the little jingles that hung down below the bridle area, horseshoes as well, horseshoe nails, excuse me, made out of iron. These are some iron knives, may have been both French and Spanish knives that we found. And these are some other items. The one up here in the far upper right is an iron handle of a chocolate cup. The Spanish love their chocolate, and this is a part of a chocolate cup. And this is a part of a hinge. You remember the pintle from before, it would actually go right through that loop and was something on which either a door or a window would have turned. Then we found a chain. This is the one we found here in the middle and the upper part. And originally we thought, oh man, this is modern. This is a part of some farming equipment or something from a much later time, until we went back and really looked into other Spanish sites and found identical types of chains, both at Presidio Los Adayas, early shipwreck, and then the Mayhew site had a chain very, very similar, in fact, identical, and it had a forged spike going through it. These are some cupreous or copper alloy elements, probably cut up pieces of French brass pots. A lot of lead objects were found, mostly in what people would call musket balls or lead balls used in these French trade guns. A lead seal down here was found as well. So on the basis of all of this information and coordinating with the Texas Historical Commission, we moved the 1936 stone that was placed there as a marker 4 or 5 miles away from its appropriate location up to Mission Concepcion in 2016. I want to really thank Dr. Jackson for spearheading this effort. The next of the sites, one of the mission-related sites, it's the farthest one to the north, and actually the first one we worked on. It's about 300 meters north of the mission proper, is NA 338. It's a fascinating site, chock full of artifacts, but very complex. And it's complex because not only are there mission period artifacts there, Native American and Spanish, but there's also artifacts that relate to an overlapping Levi Dykes farmstead from 1836 to 56. Levi Dykes, after being in the Texas Revolution, bought 300 acres from the John Durst estate and established a homestead. And he placed his buildings right on top of this mission-related site. In fact, the very first thing that we found at the whole mission complex was we dug this 2 by 2 meter unit and came upon a pit that had many artifacts. In fact, in 1/4 of this pit in one 20-centimeter level, which is a tiny fraction of the total contents of this unit, was this. Now, the artifacts that you'll see over here on the far left represent a lot of Caddo ceramics. This is from the mission period, and some of these nails are forged nails from the mission period, and some of these lead balls may be. But almost everything else here, we believe, is associated with Levi Dykes, including this impressive amount of 19th century English pottery, as well as some glass. So we did a magnetometer survey over NA 338, and a lot of these rectilinear areas that you will see here, for example, right there, we believe are associated with Levi Dykes. This is that pit, at least filled. It might have actually been constructed in the mission period, but it was filled up in the Levi Dykes period because they had a lot of stuff of his in there. But there were all these other dark anomalies, and we decided, in fact, long after this, actually was 2010 to 2018, and we have a number of other 1 by 1 square units that tested out, ground truth, these anomalies. And we're going to go through a few of those to see what we found when we ground truth these anomalies. About 95% of every time we put a 1 by 1, we came down on a cultural anomaly based on this magnetometer survey. Give you some examples. For example, this we decided to put a 1 by 1 right in this area, and we came down on the margins of this post hole, as you can see it here. Here are 3 large cultural features. These are stains that were found in this area, and these were post holes. You can actually see their profiles as we excavated them. We also found under one of these anomalies a hearth, a very hard clay hearth with ash and fired clay underneath it. And in another anomaly, which is this dark stainly area that probably goes out here, we just excavated a 1/4 of it. Once we dug this out, it was filled with these rocks, which were no doubt used for hot rock cooking, perhaps in the Spanish period. This is Chet Walker again, and this is a part of the magnetometer survey where we found this beautiful circle of dark stains. Looks just like a Caddo house, a round house, even including a central post hole. So when I saw that, I said, let's put a 1 by 1. And indeed, we came down at 20 centimeters down on top of this dark stain. When we profiled it, it turned out to be a beautiful post hole, a center post of a Caddo house. But it was a mystery because we dug several 1 by 1s inside of this house and found almost no artifacts. Very few limited Caddo ceramics, but almost nothing else. There was no hearth in the middle of this house like you often find in the middle of Caddo houses. It looked like a great empty house. What could it be? And then we remembered that in 1718, the Hainai built Governor Alarcon in his visit a house where he lived for 18 days. Could this be the house, this empty house where Governor Alarcon lived? Well, we don't know. It bears more research, but we wonder about it. What we know is that Governor Alarcon in 1718 visited the site. He there received many delegations of Indians all over Texas. And he brought to the site and built a house for her, for Angelina. And we'll discover more about her shortly. But he renamed the location for Maria de Agreda. It was Pueblo La Concepcion de Agreda. And that was the combination of the Tejas town and the mission itself. Maria de Agreda is often known as the Lady in Blue, or the Blue Nun, or the Flying Nun. She was a Franciscan nun in the Order of the Immaculate Conception over in Spain. She lived there her whole life, but she's famous for writing an 8-volume biography of the Virgin Mary entitled The Mystical City of God. She is said to have had the great gift of bilocation, to be in two places at once, both in Agreda, where her physical body was, but also an appearance that she had to Native American groups in the southwestern United States. Her body was said to be incorruptible after her death. But for what every Texan should remember about Maria de Agreda was the fact that she was a lady in blue, and she gave name to our state flower, the bluebonnet. Here's a portrait and a statue of Maria. That is a picture of her convent. And down in the lower left is a picture of her said to be incorruptible body there in Agreda. She is said to have appeared to numerous villages throughout the southwestern part of the United States. This site, Mission Concepcion, is the only place on earth that's been named in honor of her. However, we know that in 1690, that Father Hasinai at Mission San Francisco, one of the 1690 missions, the Cadi came and asked for a small piece of blue cloth for his mother, who was elderly and about to die. She wanted it because when she was young, many years before in the 1600s, she remembers that her village had been visited by the Lady in Blue who had come down from the heights. And instantly, Father Hasinai realized that this must have been Maria de Agreda. What's interesting is these Hasinai Caddo loved the color blue, because in this great work by George Avery, looking at seed bead colors, at 2 of the Hasinai Caddo sites. One is the Deshazo site, and again at HO 64, the beads, the seed beads, were predominantly blue. Another site, another mission-related site, is in a 346, which is just south of 338. It had both Spanish and Native American. What we ultimately found in our numerous 1x1 meter square units that I'm showing here that we excavated, that there were 2 structures, structure 1 and structure 2. I'll show you a little bit about each one. Looking at this 1x1 meter square unit here, I'll show you that unit, then we'll go up to the center part of structure 1. But in the first unit, we found a post hole, this dark soil that we excavated and had a nice profile of a post hole, a part of a house wall, no doubt. But what was interesting is in the fill of this post hole were these 2 Spanish forged ferrous nails and a blue bead, a very fascinating link of the materials in this post hole to the Spanish colonial period. And then this is a part of the southwestern wall of that house, another forged nail as well. Then in the center of structure 1 was this hearth, very hard fired hearth. with the hotter it gets, the more yellow it is. As it's still hot, but a little cooler on the margins, is a red color. We even see a post hole over here. What was interesting about this hearth is there were 13 points, mostly CUNY points associated with the Hainai, but that was very unusual. I've really looked into into Native American hearths in East Texas, and very few are loaded with, in fact, I can't find another one, this loaded in arrow points. In fact, in all the other 1x1s, we found almost no other points. So here we found a big collection of arrow points. What could that be? Well, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek and a little bit possibly laughable speculation on our parts, but it made us wonder a little bit about Angelina. We knew that Angelina, when she lived at Concepcion, had 2 teenage boys who lived with her, 2 teenage sons. And we kind of wondered if they might have been using their bows and arrows in the house, much like my brothers and I shot our BB guns sometimes in our house, much to my mother's chagrin. Now, that's probably pretty ludicrous speculation. However, it points to the fact that Angelina did have a house here somewhere that Alarcon had built for her. And we're just speculating on what you might find in such a house. So who was Angelina? She was a Hasinai Caddo woman, and there are many French and Spanish references to her. She was called Angelina, Angelica, Angelique. We know that she lived at Concepcion, but she perhaps was taken by the 1693 Spaniards back to Monclova and Presidio San Juan Bautista back in northern Mexico, where she grew up when she was quite young. She was a convert to Christianity. She learned the Spanish language, and as such, she became an important woman. She was not just a translator, she was a diplomat, explaining the intentions of the Spanish to the Hainai and the Hainai's needs back to the Spanish. She was called by the Europeans learned and sagacious. Interestingly, this important woman, probably the first important woman in recorded Texas history, is the only woman to give her name to a county. Out of the 254 Texas counties, only one is named for a woman, and is Angelina, and this is the only place she lived. She has often been memorialized in mythologies in Texas history, referring to her being beautiful and a young maiden, little angel. She was friendly. She was romanticized even in the 18th century by this drawing of Angelina with Francois Bellal, who she nursed back to health in the Concepcion village in 1720. But in reality, this mythology that has romanticized, sexualized her to some extent, really is in contradiction to the reality of the fact that she was a bright, educated, mature woman who was a diplomat in that time period. I happen to be the person who put together the information for the subject marker of the Texas Historical Commission for Angelina. And I emphasize this mature, responsible understanding of this very important woman in Texas history. Then the fourth of these, the complex, is the Hainai village itself, which probably was located on this rise. There was a midden out there. We know that from 1930s aerial photographs. The mission was up on the hill beyond it. We did very limited work, but in one post hole, and then in the only 1 by 1 meter square unit we excavated, we found post holes there. So we know there was architecture, there was houses in this great field, and it's almost certainly the location, the primary Hainai village where the Caddo lived. Now re-enters Louis Cicero de Saint Denis, the Frenchman, because he is a person who led the Spanish to Concepcion, and he is the one who provided goods both to the Spanish while they were there and to the Hasinai Caddo. This early 1757 map shows the Angelina River. It shows the mission at Nacogdoches with the Lanata Creek and Bonita Creeks. And over the next creek between it and the Angelina is a creek today we call the El Loco, but it was termed Conductor, El Conductor. It was named for Saint Denis because we believe that is where he had his trading camp in a Hasinai village. We were able to go back and relocate this village. It was initially worked on in 1975 by well-known Texas archaeologist Elton Pruitt, and he did important work. A part of what he found was an object. This is a part of a trigger guard, and you've guessed it, on the other side of that was the Chevrolet design from a Type C French trade gun in this area. We found another area of this site, probably 50 meters away, and we've done considerable work there. One of the things that we have found in recent years there is this Majolica gaming piece. This is from a Spanish Pueblo blue on white Majolica piece. It originally was completely round. It's been broken. And what it shows is that on this French site, the Spanish were interacting and maybe playing games with them. Just like there were French gun parts in the Spanish mission site, there was Spanish artifacts on this French site. There was a lot of cuprous material. The Caddos really enjoyed these nested brass kettles. You can see some of these ears attached to these brass kettles, nested brass kettles here, because the Caddos love to cut these up and do things with them. This is a Spanish button, a French button, maybe a French military button, and then a piece of copper alloy knife side plate. We think they had a little industry going here of cutting these French pots, folding them, rolling them up, and eventually making these little tinklers, which they traded to the native Hasinai Caddo, which they love to sew onto their dress. These are some French and perhaps a few Spanish knives, one of which has a French name on the side of it. Dr. Jackson is doing some, I think, groundbreaking research on French colonial knives in this area. There are scissors that they no doubt traded to the Caddo. There's some sword fragments, horse gear, and then a large number of French and Spanish, French gun parts. They're all French gun parts, mostly Type C. This is a Type C trade gun. This is Type D. These are Type D trade gun materials of these weaponries. There were many lead balls, 62 total actually. This says 61, but there's 62 lead balls for use in the weaponry. We did an important study, we believe. Stephen Schooler, who had done a really wonderful master's thesis at Texas State University, dealing with lead isotope ratios on materials from 8 Spanish sites in Oklahoma and Texas. And he was able to help us by procuring a number of samples of lead from these balls, and then working with the University of Texas to run those through their MSICP mass spectrometer to obtain lead isotope ratios. There are 4 isotopes, by the way, of lead: lead 204, 206, 7, and 8. And you can look at their ratios and then do a scatter plot, as is shown over here on the right. And really, they give signatures or possible signatures of where the lead originally came from. We believe this one outlier up here came from lead from the Mississippi Valley, which the French had access to. Additionally, these items down here came from Europe. Mostly, we believe, from England and the Harz Mountains in Germany. The French traded with the British for lead, and we believe that these items perhaps were brought in by the French. These are all have lead isotope signatures that are very similar to that found from Mexico in the mines, the lead ores there. So these may represent musket balls that were, or lead balls, I should say, projectiles that were of Spanish relationships. When you put the two sites together, Mission Concepcion and the Mayhew site, you'll notice there's almost equal numbers of Mexican and European lead, which really speaks to that dynamic interaction that the French and the Spanish had out here on the frontier, where they were far away from their primary bases and such as Behar and Mobile for the French and the Spanish. And they were out here on the frontier, and they were interacting and trading. We know that the French adapted easily to the Caddo world because they were willing to forge kinship ties and marry in. And they often would exchange any need of control of the Caddo for their mutually beneficial trade. But what's interesting is that in the early to mid 18th century, we believe that the Spanish also recognized that in Tejas country, who the primary and most important power in the area was, and that is the Hasinai Caddo. So there was a dynamic interchange between the French, Spanish, and the Hasinai Caddo in this area. It's very likely that the Spanish went to the French and Hasinai camp over near, not far away from Bioloco for trade and conversation, just as the French would come and visit the Spanish mission in the Hainai village for similar reasons and for religious purposes. It has certainly been great to visit with you today. And I want to thank you, Drew, for inviting me to give this talk. And I hope this is helpful in giving some color to early Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Middlebrook. And if any of our viewers have a question for Tom, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you.